Richard Manifold Craig was an Irish writer. Born in Dublin in 1845, he pursued his medical studies in Dublin before joining the British Army as a surgeon, having reached the rank of lieutenant colonel by the time of his retirement. He wrote several books, one of his most curious being The Weird of the Silken Thomas, the story of Thomas Fitzgerald, the 10th Earl of Kildare, who had become a rebel against Henry VIII in his capacity as Lord of Ireland and had been executed at age 24. His most intriguing is his The Sacrifice of Fools, a melodrama of insanity amid the jungles of India. He died in London in 1913. The Sacrifice of Fools was published in 1896 in London. The story begins by narrating how Lord Mears commissioned a certain young artist named Carlo Montanaro to work on a fresco for him. What the Lord doesn't know is that the highly eccentric artist had been smitten by Mears's daughter and only child Miriam. Upon the artist's proposal, Miriam tells Carlo to never speak to her again. Soon thereafter, she is seen walking with Rivers Rutherglen, her childhood friend whom her father wishes her to marry, when Rivers is suddenly shot by Carlo. Unfortunately for the artist, he only slightly wounded his rival in one arm, so that Carlo's subsequent suicide was rather pointless. A few weeks before the wedding of Rivers and Miriam, a distraught woman, Carlo Montanaro's widow, arrives in the town of Manchester with a 5-year-old boy named Ferdinand. The Rutherglens have quite a happy life, with a daughter named Salome coming in along the way, but when Salome is just 16 years old, her father suddenly dies. Around this time, Carlo Montanaro's widow continues her rather overdramatic plotting against Miriam and her daughter, since she hasn't stopped blaming Miriam for Carlo's death even after 16 years. She plots to introduce her son Ferdinand to Salome and to make them fall in love, knowing her son shares his father's tendency towards insanity. She hopes that when the two marry, her son would go crazy and make Salome's life hell. Now, from this point on, the plot only can happen realistically because of the characters acting in ways that rather stretch credibility. Where Carlo's widow plots to have her son marry a woman and then be driven insane to avenge an unfaithful madman 16 years on, Miriam decides she will outright refuse to mention the fact of Ferdinand's parentage to her daughter, even though she does come to know of it in due time. This happens for absolutely no reason other than to simply not give her daughter actual valid reasons not to see Ferdinand beyond "I forbid it." Because, that always works with teenagers. When Salome subsequently leaves with her husband, Miriam decides she will not leave her room until her daughter comes back to help her get dressed. And she stays holed up in her room for literal years. After her daughter leaves with Ferdinand for India, where he is employed as an engineer, a certain Captain Saville is invited inside of Miriam's home and is asked by Miriam to go and find her daughter. It transpires that Ferdinand took not only his wife to India, but also his mute African servant and, as it later turns out, a pair of African gorillas. Following the failure of the road project Ferdinand was attached to, he buggers off from the campsite and he and his wife move to a forgotten rock temple in the middle of the jungle. Sadly, the interesting premise of an insane man keeping his wife a virtual prisoner in an ancient temple with deadly African gorillas for company, along with a mute servant who is deathly devoted to her insane husband, comes crashing down when the husband dies halfway through the book, thus removing the entire main dramatic hook for the story. What follows is 100 pages of setting up Captain Saville to run across Salome by pure accident in a way which will enable him to be her next husband, whereupon the plot shifts to a boring, trite murder mystery plot about some people killed 20 years before the story, whom no one in the story ever met. As an aside, the villainous murdering priest Narain shares his name with a character from a Joseph Conrad story of the same name. The basic idea of the book had a lot of potential for a good psychological horror story, despite the rather hokey and overly dramatic way the characters acted in the beginning. But the way this ends up proves that the writer was rather fixated on cliché and melodrama and might have stumbled upon this premise more by accident. The Spectator's review from 1897 summarizes this brilliantly. To quote, "We are sure that the author could write very good fiction if he chose, for he knows how to make the most of good material."